Welcome to the City of Bothell Planning Commission. Tonight is Wednesday, July 25th, 2018 at 6 p.m. All commissioners are present and accounted for, and with the exception of Commissioner Hampton, who is absent and excused. And with that, we will go ahead and see if there are any non-agenda public comments, and I do not believe there are any. No minutes to approve, no new business this evening, no public hearing tonight. And I guess with that, then, we will go ahead and jump into the study session tonight, which regards the downtown plan and code amendments. Will be led tonight by Senior Planner David Boyd. Oh, and we're also joined by Mike Stanger from Arch. I didn't know you were going to be here tonight, Mike. So, see ya.
Yes, thank you, and good evening. Yeah, I asked Mike to come because even though we haven't yet done the analysis for potential affordable housing requirements for the two code amendments that involve capacity increases and therefore have a nexus for affordable housing requirements, I thought that there may be some questions about that, and it might be worth discussing how we do that analysis. I'm going to try to do this from the table here. Tonight's session, I'm going to start off with, I think I reported that we did a study session with Council on June 12th on downtown plan implementation in general, kind of a review of downtown plan implementation, giving the background. And I thought that the Planning Commission might benefit from seeing that. And perhaps some of you, I think David was at the study session. I can't remember, but may have watched it on TV. But anyway, yeah. So I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. But just an outline, we talked about the downtown planning process, where we started, what was the vision, and then we talked about implementation to date and planned projects at this point in time, and then we talked about the proposed plan and code amendments and a fee proposal. We're not going to get into the fee proposal, but the proposed plan and code amendments are the main topic tonight. But just to get a little bit of the background, and I'll note that we're joined by Community Development Director Mike Cotterman. And
thanks for pointing out I was late. Sorry about that.
And so we started in 2005, and one of the first things we did was revise the downtown sub-area boundary. Previously, the campus was part of the North Creek sub-area. We thought it was important to include the campus in the downtown sub-area. And we actually, and then we limited the downtown sub-area to all of the zones that had mixed-use zoning, that had both residential and commercial, or at least had commercial designations. So that meant removing some areas to the south along East Riverside Drive that were straight residential zoning. And so those got shifted into the Norway Hill sub-area. So that's the revised form of the downtown sub-area there, outlined in red. And then we did kind of a review of existing conditions in downtown. We called it the Downtown Digest, not just existing conditions, but also past planning efforts in downtown, related to downtown. So that kind of established the starting point. Part of the digest was, this is the zoning that we had in downtown prior to to working on the downtown plan. And I've added an overlay of the red. The red areas are all of the areas where, prior to the downtown plan, you could build up to 65 feet. The perception is that we did a major upzone in downtown, but actually, when we adopted the plan, the colors don't come through great here, but the red area there is the area where we allowed 6 stories and 65 feet at the beginning. So we actually reduced the area where you could build to 65 feet. And that's one reason why we didn't, at that time, institute affordable housing requirements or provisions, because there wasn't a strong nexus due to that fact. And then the downtown plan includes the comprehensive portion of the plan, and this is the revitalization strategy and the community vision portion of the plan. Important piece was connecting the campus to downtown, kind of establishing the boundaries of downtown and really consolidating where we where we have pedestrian-oriented retail into the core areas. We've identified the high priority city actions, realigning 522, providing entitlements and a streamlined approval process through the planned Action EIS, and that's ongoing. Redevelopment of the North Shore School District property, also ongoing. Transforming what was SR 527 into a multi-way boulevard as a real, not just as a transportation facility, but as a real placemaking effort. New City Hall, extending and enhancing Main Street, which the major enhancement of Main Street is done. There's still a phase to be done over to 104th, and the extension to the west still to be done. And then the downtown plan that developed once we established the community vision and identified city actions, we got into the regulations, and this is the downtown district's map that came out of that. And this is all part of the downtown sub-area regulations, which is the downtown's portion of the municipal code, the zoning code. As part of the downtown, I alluded to this a little bit earlier, we did a planned action EIS, environmental impact statement, which analyzed the impacts for the whole area, and so that any development that was consistent with the downtown plan, and we don't allow development that's not consistent, doesn't have to go through its own environmental process and determination. It established thresholds for development in downtown, and to date, we have made pretty significant progress towards those thresholds. The thresholds were 2,736 housing units, and we have built or are under construction over 1,700 to date. There are another couple hundred permitted or under review, and we've had pre-application or pre-application consultations for about 313 additional. It also set thresholds for commercial development of a little over 500,000, or a little under 500,000, 643,000. We've built or under construction. We have a little under half a million. And as you can see from the numbers there, we are going to be pushing up against that threshold quite soon. So that's, and we've been conservative in the numbers that we're counting. We're counting some square footage under commercial construction, like Popkini Stadium, locker rooms that we need to take a closer look and see if, and also the UW campus construction that it's being done under its own EIS. So the built numbers may come down, but that's going to be, I think, a major work program for, maybe not a major work program, but an important thing to look at next year is those thresholds.
Yeah, can you explain those thresholds really quick?
Well, so we analyze the impacts for development up to those thresholds. So it's not that when we reach the thresholds, we have to stop any building. It's just that then development would proceed under the traditional method where each project does has its own environmental review and SEPA determination.
Thanks, Dave.
So as we near those thresholds, though, we may look at whether we want to do supplemental supplemental to the planned action EIS so that we can continue to develop under that. And then as we've gone along, we've done a number of amendments, and I just highlighted a couple here. Maximum building length was one where the graphic in the plan didn't quite match the text, and the text was more specific, so that was controlling, and so we've made a change to the graphic, and basically the text identifies the primary building mass as what we need to control under the maximum building length. And so projects like the 104 basically built 3 wings butting up against 185th, and they are all just slightly higher than the spine of the building that runs east-west. And we determined that those wings, at least on the 185th facade, constituted the primary building mass. Height was another code amendment that we did. So just as an example, there have been several others, but
at least on the 185th.
the downtown plan established a slope top box building envelope that followed the contours of the land, which seemed like a good idea at the time.
Height was another.
But it proved to be difficult to implement. It was difficult for both applicants and reviewers. So we went to a simpler method where we establish a average grade plane and then a flat top box going up from that level. We also, at a different time, made some adjustments to the maximum height, not the number of stories, but the height in feet in the downtown core and downtown neighborhood. We discovered initially with the design of this building, which could have been 5 floors per the zoning. It's actually only 4, but we were still running up against that maximum building height, and because modern office buildings have much higher floor-to-floor heights than typical residential building, and the height limits that we set were better suited to residential. So we did raise those up to the heights that were analyzed in the EIS, so it was still covered by the analysis in the EIS. We've also made little adjustments, like the height for elevator penthouses. We learned after the fact that they just can't be 10 feet. The code requirements, they need more headroom at the top of the shaft. So that brings us to the downtown plan and code amendments for 2018. So council initiated 6 different code amendments for downtown. We're moving forward at this point with 4 of those. We're considering a rezone of the general commercial district to SR 522 corridor. We're considering removing the remaining density limits in the downtown transition district. We're considering changes to the public open space requirements, and also considering changes to the design review process for downtown projects. And I'll go into each of those in some detail now. And feel free to jump in with questions as we go along.
Just really quick, Dave, yeah. On your memorandum on the first page, because when it says items C, E, and F would increase residential capacity and therefore potentially include affordable housing requirements. Oh, I see. Never mind. Item E has been deferred back and will be brought back. Okay. Never mind. You can strike that question.
So yeah, there are 2 others that could come forward at a later time, but these are the ones that we felt were ready for your consideration now. So the first one is actually a plan and code amendment because it's a rezone. Late in the downtown plan adoption process. City Council heard from a resident up on, I think this has a laser pointer. See if I can figure that out. Up on West Hill, who was concerned about the general commercial area, which is in green in that map, being rezoned to SR 522 corridor, which would allow 4 stories and 45 feet. General commercial allows 35 feet, no story limit. And he convinced council to go ahead and retain that general commercial zoning without a whole lot of, there really wasn't time for staff to do much analysis of that. And so it's awkward to have, the downtown plan is a wholly new form-based zoning code. And so it's a little bit awkward to have a citywide, one of the old citywide code designations within the downtown plan. It creates some confusion about whether we apply downtown plan sign standards or road frontage standards to that area, or we apply the citywide standards. So it had sort of been on a back burner of something that staff wanted to revisit. And earlier this year, we got requests from 2 property owners in that area who basically said that they were thinking about some changes on their property, potential sale of their property, and they were hearing from potential developers that the GC zoning was quite limiting. And so they approached us about whether there might be a possibility for a rezone, and since it's something that we were interested in pursuing anyway, we added it to the docket. And now we've had a chance to start the kind of more detailed analysis that we would have liked to have done when this was first proposed. So the map on the colored map shows the area in green. The map to the far right shows a straight photo ortho map of the area with the GC area outlined in dashed yellow. So you kind of get a sense of what the built form is and the landscape form. And then across the bottom is an aerial photo of the area, which gives you a little bit better idea of what the buildings are there. So it goes basically from the gas station at 180th and 522, actually Ormbrecht Street, which is a private street at the end of 97th there, and then extends all the way down to Wayne Curve and the Sherlock storage facility, the large.
Oh, Dave, can I ask you a quick question? So you refer to green. You're obviously, you're talking about the lime green.
The
there?
lime green, yes.
Okay, as opposed to the other green. Okay, thank you.
Sorry about that.
No.
And then the analysis that we've started to do with the help of our planning intern, Daniel Olson, who's also joining us here tonight, is to look at the topography and what could be developed there. And this is just a start of what might happen there. And we've chosen the Carriage Auto Rebuild site as an example. So the building in, I do need to get a pointer here. So the Carriage Auto Rebuild site is here, and what we're showing here is a 4-story building, parking level, and then 3 stories above that that get up to the 45-foot height limit that would exist under GC zoning. And in the bottom aerial, it's right here. Yeah, just north of Yakima Fruit. And this isn't one of the sites where we've heard that there's interest in redeveloping, so this is all hypothetical. The reason we chose that site is it's right below the single-family houses up on the bluff above where we heard the earlier concern. So you can see, even if they build up to the height limit there, there really isn't view blockage to the river, directly to the river. In fact, the Bothell, the Riverfront Landing project and other development of that scale that could happen on the other side of 526, of 522, where we do have SR 522 corridor zoning, would provide further view blockage than any development along the west side of 522 there. The other concern we heard was that apartment buildings would be built up high enough where residents would be looking into their backyards. But as you can see, that the topography is going to prevent that from happening. Now, we do need to do some further analysis. If you really did some serious earth moving, you could build a building that would be further to the west and further into the hillside, which would raise the average grade plane and the height of the building. So we are going to do that, but we think this is probably the more likely form that you'll see to be developed there.
Dave?
Yeah.
Can you clarify the height on GC and 522 again? What are the two heights?
GC height limit is 35 feet. Okay. There's no limit on the number of floors, but essentially it's going to be 3 stories. In SR 522 corridor, it's 45 feet and 4 floors. So just a little additional couple of other views in the upper right. You see the existing conditions with the carriage auto rebuild site in the parcel area in pink. And then on the lower left, the hypothetical development on that site. And so you can see that relative to the surrounding development. So we'll be doing more of this analysis, and we'll also be working with Arch to analyze what the increase in development capacity is and how what is a logical and fair affordable housing requirement to impose based on that increase. Kevin?
Yeah, question. What's happening with 522 in that vicinity? And I ask that because, quite frankly, I'm a fairly regular customer at Yakima Fruit, and it's really challenging to get out of there and make a turn and go in the other direction. And you see that over in Kenmore, where essentially, if you're coming out of businesses, you're only going right.
I think that's probably going to be the future of that segment of 522 as well. We haven't done the full design there. We've done about 30% design, and that was done in 2007. So with the Sound Transit 522 Bus Rapid Transit project, the BRT project, we're starting to develop those plans or working with Sound Transit. But there will be some changes. We'll have an westbound BAT lane, business access and transit lane. They are not planning an eastbound business access and transit lane at this point, but we are going to reserve space for a future one as development happens along that corridor.
Now, taking that westbound lane, coming out of one of those businesses, you'd be compelled to go west. It looks to me to be a fair distance before you could turn around and come back east. You're coming into the curve,
Yeah.
and then there are the constraints with the hill and the golf course. Is that part of the analysis as well, how
Yeah.
people would get back around?
And I think there would be a U-turn at 96th there, down by Wayne Curve.
Okay.
So go back here.
Thank you.
You'd be able to do a U-turn here.
Civil engineers looking at those sight distances around the curve and a little concerned.
Well, it would be a controlled curve. It would only be when the oncoming traffic had a red, so. And most likely there would be a U-turn toward the north part of that corridor. But that's all still to be determined.
So Dave, you said there was maybe a 30% design that had been completed for the 522 corridor?
Yes.
Is that project in the works? Is it in the capital improvement plan? Is there any anticipated timeline for it at this point?
It's in our capital improvement plan, and it's now in the Sound Transit 3 plan. So to institute the bus rapid transit on 522, it will need to be completed by 2024.
2024, okay. I mean, the issue that I'm a civil engineer and I've done transportation quite a bit, and usually the issue that you see is, right now there's no sidewalks, and so there's kind of a little bit of a free-form access to some of these businesses, and it's a little bit informal, and it works okay. And then when you widen and put sidewalks in there, then you're taking away kind of some of this informal parking, and then it kind of constrains and compresses the availability of on-site parking, and that usually causes an issue. And sometimes the answer to that is, kind of providing joint access between some of these properties, so they're kind of sharing a little bit and that kind of thing. But it'll certainly be a challenge on this site because of, everything's just right on the highway, so.
We've already been faced with some challenges. You haven't seen any new development along there, but there have been some attempts. We've had some proposals, and we've had to use those 30% plans to determine where they can build to in order to maintain space for potential future eastbound bat lane and for the required setbacks. So, any other questions?
Yeah, the last question, I have a question on the south side of 522, it's already zone 522 corridor, so we can already build, there could be a 45-foot development there.
Yes.
But the other side is limited to 35 foot. So really what we're talking about here is bringing them equal.
Yes, and I should have mentioned that's one of the reasons for doing that, besides just having everything in one of the downtown districts, is generally we like to have the same zoning on both sides of a street.
Dave, one quick question. What's the difference in requirements on first floor commercial space between general commercial versus the 522? Would we see a big constriction of commercial availability down there, or would we look at mostly apartments, or what's your take?
Well, the market would dictate that. I'm gonna get into the potential uses here pretty soon. So if I can
Sure.
Put that question on hold. I did want to touch, the first thing we would look at would be the comprehensive plan designation. So when this GC zoning was retained late in the downtown plan, we just added this paragraph explaining that. And so there may be some other changes that we want to make to the community vision for this SR 522 corridor if we do this plan amendment. But at the minimum, we would just strike that language. And then to get to your question, both GC and SR 522 corridor are, in terms of the commercial uses allowed, are more auto-oriented commercial. And in the downtown plan, prior to the downtown plan, we would allow pedestrian-oriented commercial uses in pretty much in any commercial zone in the downtown sub-area. One thing that we did is we concentrated that in the downtown core, mostly on Main Street and Bothell Way, so that we really created the critical mass for pedestrian-oriented retail, and then left these corridors to provide the more auto-oriented commercial uses. So that's why in the use tables, pedestrian-oriented retail is not allowed in the SR 522 corridor. Neither is neighborhood center retail. That's the kind of retail we have out at Beardsley Crossing or the QFC Center, QFC Rite Aid Center. The individual developments would be allowed to have corner store retail, very limited retail, in kind of convenience retail intended to serve the residents of that project and in the immediate vicinity. And they would be allowed to have office, civic and cultural uses, lodging, and the big change would be GC does not allow any residential uses, and SR 522 corridor does. So what will we see happen? I really don't know for sure, but we could see straight residential development there. That would be allowed. I think we might likely see some mixed use with more auto-oriented commercial uses on the ground level. In this district, you are allowed to have exposed parking garages, so the illustrations here do show a building that basically sits above a parking structure. It does require some, I mean, there would have to be a main entrance if this was, and some sort of facade treatment there, but it doesn't need to be wrapped as it would be in the downtown core.
So Dave, in that case, there's not a requirement, you're saying, for a storefront ground level retail or something like that. You could, as long as it's faced correctly, you could have a parking facility on the bottom.
You could. The actual developments that we've had proposed in this district have been townhome developments with front entries right on the street, and parking garages, tuck under garages around the backside. We had one dental office proposal for the site, which oriented, kind of had a two-way orientation, parking in the back and an entrance that was accessible from both the back and front side of the building.
I guess just a quick comment on this proposed change. Part of it, I guess, that I like is that, going from a general commercial where there's no retail or no residential allowed to a use where it is allowed, I think makes a lot of sense, particularly on a transit corridor like this. So I like that idea, and I'm hopeful we can get some density right there on that line, where the transportation infrastructure is. So I really think that's important.
To delve just a little deeper into the uses, and I apologize, this is not very legible, but this is the whole use chart. So in this district, we're primarily looking at the auto-oriented uses here. Like I said, corner store retail is allowed, but it's fairly limited in size. And then civic, cultural, office, lodging, and residential are all allowed as well. So that's, and it's by adding that residential component that we create the nexus for an affordable housing requirement. Actually, it's a combination of adding the ability to do housing and adding that extra floor and height. And we haven't done the analysis to say, how much what that requirement would be, but that'll be coming prior to the September 5th continued public hearing.
So what is the process for that? You answered the second part of my question on the timing, but so between now and September 15th, what will happen? And I see you looked.
September 5th, yeah. Mike chose a opportune time to step out, but basically they do an analysis of what the capacity is and what they do a pro forma of what you could build there, both before and after, and they try to make it something of a zero-sum game. So if you're increasing your development capacity by X amount, then we can require that amount in affordable housing, and actually the goal is to make it so that they still get some bonus, but part of the bonus that they get goes towards providing the affordable housing.
So you say they can require. What's the process for determining what the requirements will be?
That, too, we'll get into further. Some of the planning commissioners were here when we went through this exercise in Nike Hill and South Riverside. And the percentage of units required varies depending on the increase in capacity, and then the affordability level can vary also on that. And the affordability level can also vary on whether it's anticipated to be ownership housing or rental housing. In this case, it's probably mostly going to be, well, actually, we're hearing some interest from townhome developers, so there may be a mix of ownership and rental housing in this zone.
Is storage unit a permitted use of this space if we change to 522?
That's an interesting question. The charts don't specifically identify storage units, but they identify warehouse retail as the kind of the closest thing to self-storage warehouse, and that's really not that close at all. So we might have to make some tweaks to this chart, and I think that's something for the commission to consider about whether they want to tweak the chart to explicitly allow self-storage. That is an existing use within the district, so the existing use will be grandfathered in. But that's one thing that we've heard from a couple of the property owners is that some developers have approached them with an interest of doing more self-storage warehouse. And we're not sure that that's the gateway to the downtown that we want. But
I personally would be opposed to that usage, but I think we should definitely talk about that more. I think bringing residential in along there would be great for younger professionals who would want an easy way in and out of Bothell, as well as just having easy access to transport. I'm a little hesitant about putting more self-storage along 522, much to the gateway to Bothell comment you made.
Mike, while you stepped away, there were some questions about how we would calculate the affordable housing requirement, and I tried to answer it, but maybe if you could talk a little bit about that
Time
before we move on.
So what we would do is to try and weigh for you or evaluate the benefit that property owners might get from increasing the development potential in terms of number of units, and against the value that the public gets from the affordable housing. And not to get too technical about it, but we would consider comparable land value increases and or comparable land values. The increased density we would treat as if it were an increase in land. You know, you would get so many units if you had, say, 1 acre, but if you raised the density by 50%, it would be like getting another half an acre of land in the same density. And so we'd look at assessed valuations, market prices, things of that nature, and then value the public benefit by looking at the difference between what rental income would be at various affordability levels versus market rents. And so we would present that in the way of options, and then it would be kind of a value decision for you to make and the council ultimately on how much value of the value that the private sector is getting that the city wants to claw back, if you will, in a way of public benefit.
So with that, I'll move on to the next code amendment, which also would be increasing the capacity and therefore providing the nexus for an affordable housing requirement. So this is in the downtown transition district, and what we're considering is removing the 20 unit per acre density limit on the remaining downtown transition or DT areas that have it. In 2014, the Planning Commission actually recommended removing the density limit entirely, and that was another late change during the downtown plan adoption process. The EIS was analyzed on a proposal that had no density limit, that basically limited the density by the height setbacks and more than, in most cases, more than anything else, how much parking you can reasonably fit on a site. We fairly early on got some inquiries about or interest in developing along 185th, but some concerns about the density limit making redevelopment unlikely. So council went along with the increase along 185th and on some of the areas that weren't immediately abutting either single-family zones or zones or areas that still had single-family housing, and they basically kept the density limit in 3 areas, all along the West Hill frontage of the downtown sub-area, and 2 areas, what I'm calling the West Maywood frontage and the South Maywood frontage. So those areas still have the 20 unit per acre limit, and not surprisingly, we haven't seen much interest in development. We've seen some interest. Folks have come and asked us, what they could do, and in many cases they can build fewer units than they already have on the land.
Dave, is there an associated building height to that same zone?
Yeah, the building height is 3 stories and 35 feet, and that would, we're not proposing any changes in that, just the density limit. The map on the right here shows what some of the existing densities are in and near that area. So they range from about half of the 20 unit per acre density limit to 6 times, or 3 times 20 unit per acre. This site at the north end is currently right about at the 20 units per acre. But all of that development is on this one of the parcels. There's another parcel that wraps around the back. So they, in theory, they could add to that project on that undeveloped portion of the land, but the density limit wouldn't allow them to do that. So again, we have the aerial map with the with that area outlined in dashed yellow, and the oblique aerial photo of the area, just to give a sense of the character. So there is quite a bit of apartment development in and adjacent to that area now. Some of our existing affordable housing stock is there. King County Housing Authority has this property and this property, and then some of the market rate housing there is relatively affordable. It's older housing stock.
And Dave, one thing interesting to note, I think, about this particular, I know we're going to talk about a couple different areas with this designation, is that this one, to me, it does kind of, the hill tends to kind of slope up, right? So if you were to get more density per acre, potentially, it may not affect people uphill as much.
It's similar to that GC area in that it does sit at the bottom of West Hill, and the adjacent single-family properties are generally substantially higher. They're the other thing that's different about this than the other two is that it is right up against single-family zoning, our 9600 and our 8400 zoning. The ones along West Hill are generally up against our 2800, our 4000.
Oh, you mean West Maywood?
West Maywood.
Okay.
They have denser zoning, but often in many cases that's denser zoning that still has single-family housing.
Exactly. They still have some older single-family homes.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So, so moving on to the West Maywood frontage, again, in the middle, the aerial map with the adjacent zoning, the oblique aerial view of it, looking from the west, and then just a example of the probably one of the nicer houses in there. The houses along Bothell Way are older houses. I think they're probably all on our historic inventory, and some may be even register eligible.
Dave, to clarify on the West Hill, has there been interest in redeveloping that area?
Yes, we have heard from developers that have looked at, I think one looked at one of these sites along here, probably one that I didn't actually put a number on, where the existing density was higher than 20 units per acre, and therefore didn't make any sense to buy for redevelopment.
So, and I guess the question is, like, a developer would have purchased a piece of property that had, say, 25 and redeveloped it with 25 or 30, and I'm making numbers up here. And so by removing that, we would have allowed that activity to happen and possibly gained additional housing in that community.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, and that has happened along 185th, but the development hasn't happened yet, but we have 3 projects that will see a little bit later in the presentation, infill projects right along 185th that probably wouldn't have happened without if that density limit hadn't been lifted.
And I'm going to ask the same question on this one and help pre-ask it on the next one. Talk about the interest in redeveloping these properties. Like, have we had projects that come up?
Nothing that's gone to the point of a, well, actually, take that back. There has been a pre-application for a townhome development on this vacant parcel. So a vacant parcel still has some interest and provides some return even at the 20 unit per acre density limit. They haven't moved beyond pre-application. They may be waiting to see if there's an increase. But that was a townhome proposal. That site might lend itself to a somewhat denser form, maybe apartment type housing there. I've had conversations with one of the owners of the large single-family parcels tucked in the back there that had some interest, at least in knowing what could be done with the property, but it hasn't gone beyond that.
So are we also looking at the level of service on those roads around there with potential increases in density? I know some of those intersections are pretty challenging during certain times of the day. Bothell Way north of 190th gets jammed up pretty good before 9 o'clock. Corner of 100th and 190th can be very difficult. You don't want to be anywhere near there when the seniors are driving towards high school in the morning.
Oh, the high school seniors, not the senior citizens.
No, the senior citizens are getting over the bridge from Riverside Landing. That's another traffic issue, but that's not here. But just generally, there are some challenging traffic issues now, and how's increased density being considered in light of that?
Yeah. Well, traffic was analyzed in the planned action EIS. One of the big factors in the analysis was Bothell Way to the north. And one of the big concerns that we heard was, will all this development spur a lot of neighborhood cut-through traffic? And the analysis said that increasing the capacity along Bothell Way, which is in the plans, was in the plans then, and still is in the plans. In fact, we're just now, I think we've just been awarded a grant to start early design work on that portion of Bothell Way from downtown up towards Safeway. So that's in the works. It'll take several years to get through the whole design, acquisition, and construction process. But those improvements and the other improvements we made to the capacity along 522 in the analysis we did were going to handle the growth that was anticipated.
You know, the redevelopment of Country Village is going to bring a lot of traffic down there as well. So there's a lot of pressure going to be on that stretch.
So the third area is what I'm calling the South Maywood frontage along 186th. So in the plan view on the top, north is up, so it's along the south side of 186th between 103rd and 101st. The oblique aerial is the reverse view from the north, showing the street frontage of the development on that block. And so it's primarily fairly modest single-family homes on small lots. There are a couple of commercial developments at the west end of the block. So it's somewhat similar to the development that we have along 185th, and probably would be, have the same similar development considerations and pressures. So that's, and then the analysis for the affordable housing requirement, if Planning Commission chooses to go ahead with removing this, the density limit here would be similar to what it would be for the other areas that we've discussed.
Dave, have you heard from any of the homeowners on this street, which I actually like? I walk down it quite a bit. I think it's just a great street. With some really affordable houses on it. I know it just happens to be really close to downtown. But, I mean, have you heard from any of the owners there that they're requesting any such change?
No, we haven't had any, I'm not aware of any redevelopment interest in this particular block. We will be doing, we haven't yet done any notification for a rezone like this. Our required notification is just the notice, or published notice. But we did tell City Council when they initiated this that we would do the kind of notification we do for a project where we would notify all the property owners within 500 feet of the proposed area. So we'll do that notification certainly prior to any public hearing, but we're gonna we're planning to do that prior to this continued study session on September 5th.
Okay. Yeah.
So when I was reading the packet earlier today, what is the driving function of the South Maywood decision? The other two seem very logical to me, but this one stuck out as kind of odd, and especially now hearing there's been no interest. So I'm curious, why South Maywood? Why this particular stretch?
We're just putting all of the areas that have this density limit out there for consideration, and that was what was originally proposed in the downtown plan, the staff and consultant proposal. When we partially removed the density limit in 2014, the Planning Commission at that time recommended removing it entirely. So this is kind of taking another shot at that with the added layer of getting an affordable housing requirement out of it. But in this case, the number of units, affordable units that could be created is going to be relatively modest.
But I think if I read right, there's a considerable number of historic homes in that neighborhood. So, I'm curious to, we'll definitely talk about this later, but I'm concerned about what that means, redeveloping some of the more historic houses. To clarify a point, though, it sounds like these were the last 3 areas with this limit, and we're basically unifying. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
And there aren't any houses on the historic register here, but there are probably a number that would be on our historic inventory, or potentially all of them are on the historic inventory. And another part of the analysis we'll be doing between now and September is having our historic preservation consultant do an assessment, and so we can give you a better picture of what the historic resources are.
And Dave, just on that, related to that note, so at September 5th, or in the actual meeting with the public, could there potentially be a way to break up the 3 could they be standalone, or do they all have to be adopted together?
No,
Or
they could be each done individually. You could select parts of each of them or parts of any of them. Yeah.
Okay, great.
That's essentially what happened last time. City Council chose to do a partial removal, and we I can't remember exactly how that played out, but I think we had 2 sessions with the City Council. At the first session they said, well, we want you to come back to us with a proposal for partial removal, and and they made some tweaks to that when we brought it back.
Great, thanks.
I'm a huge fan of uniformity, so hearing that we are trying to unify, I fully support. I do think we should bring it up in 3 separate discussion points in the September meeting. Like I said, I feel strongly the first 2 are straightforward in my opinion. This one, I'm curious to hear what the feedback is.
Okay, great.
So moving on, away from the code amendments that have affordable housing opportunities, we have also been charged to consider changes to our public open space regulations. And here I've got a couple examples of a couple of projects. The first apartment building that was built under our downtown plan is the 104, and they have created courtyard spaces, an entry courtyard that's open to the public, and 2 courtyards along their north frontage that are there are private patios lining those, and an area that's open to the public in the middle. And you see it, the public area here, and that's separated from the private areas by landscaped raised planters. We've heard some criticism that nobody uses those public spaces, but even if they're not heavily used, they do provide some breathing room, open space along that what we hope will become a even more important pedestrian corridor, especially with the buses moving along that corridor in the future. This development. So let me take a step back. In every district in downtown has a public open space requirement based on the number of dwelling units or the square footage of commercial space, except the downtown core, where we're encouraging lot line to lot line development. So the 104 is wholly within the downtown neighborhood district, so it had a fairly significant public open space requirement. the same developer was doing the Six Oaks project shortly on the tails of the 104, and it was going through permitting as they were starting construction on the 104, or as they were finishing permitting on 104. And for the 104, they originally proposed to use a provision in the code for a fee in lieu of providing the public open space. And that provision was put there primarily for the smaller infill lots where it really just didn't make sense to provide a postage stamp-sized open space. But they made a fairly compelling case for going that route. And then they said, well, we're doing this other project here, which is split zone. It's mostly downtown core with no public open space, but it's on this somewhat oddly shaped parcel, and it has these Six Oaks that we're saving as the namesake for our project. So we actually would like to provide more public open space there, and can we transfer some of the required public open space from the 104 to Six Oaks? And at the time, the determination was made that yes, that was acceptable. So at the Six Oaks, there are the oaks along the south side. On the west side is a small off-leash dog area, a rain garden, and then next to their rear entrance is more of a hardscape patio area that's open to the public. So we're getting a variety of public open spaces. The picture on the bottom here shows the Six Oaks on the south side, and those are two examples of how that's been playing out. Three other examples.
If I may, so I really enjoy public open space. I share the question you kind of alluded to earlier about how much these are used. I think in the 104, they serve a good architectural purpose to break up the mass of the building. I doubt that's going to be used. So I have that question. I frequently walk my dog around behind Six Oaks there. I had no idea that was a public space. So I don't know what the requirements are as far as notice, and I don't know that I'd go in there with him anyway, but I've walked by there any number of times, and maybe I'm oblivious to it, but I didn't see any notice. It seems a very private space. I know that it's open, you can see it, but it doesn't seem welcoming. So.
Yeah. Well, we did tell them they couldn't put a lock on the gate, but so the gate is open and anybody can use it, but we didn't require them to sign it as publicly accessible. Maybe we should.
Just as far as the 104, that went in right down the hill from our house, and at first it was a little bit, but I think they did a really good job of it. And I guess I'll have to disagree. I think the open spaces on that one are particularly good. I see people using those all the time. So I don't know. I like it because it faces the main corridor. So there's a lot of opportunity for people to use it. And I think they did a good job on it.
Good to know. So three other examples that are kind of in process, at least were when I took this picture. The one that's furthest along is what's now called Addition Apartments, the half-block project between 102nd and 103rd on the south side of 185th. And there, the majority of their public open space is along that 185th frontage, and it sits atop their parking garage. It was a very tight site. They needed the full area of the site to do an efficient parking structure, but they did have this opportunity to put some public open space that leads into one of the entrances to the building, and we did require them to do a stairway from the sidewalk at the south end, so there was a space where somebody could, even if they weren't going to the building, they could walk through that space, and they're going to be installing some plaques describing some of the houses that were on that site previously in that space in a way positioned at the top of the stairs to help draw people into that space. But that was not, building is wholly in the downtown neighborhood district, and that doesn't fully meet their open space requirements. So they did pay a fee in lieu for the remainder of their required open space.
And so so the fee in lieu, where does that go? I mean, that goes into a pool, and so where is it used within the city, and who decides that?
We're working on tightening up the rules and the way that is used, but the theory is that it would be used for new public open space within the downtown sub-area, so within walking distance of the project, which is different than the parks and open space impact fee, which can go anywhere in the city. But we are, at the same time we're looking at these code amendments, we're looking at some procedural changes to address how those monies are collected and what they can go towards. So in downtown, they can go towards the Horse Creek Plaza, for example.
Thanks, Dave.
Similarly, the Mercantile Building, one difference is the Mercantile Building is also split zone, so it's most of it, basically up to this point, is in the downtown core. So the only part of the building that had a public open space requirement was the west end, or the east end. But they are also building their public open space partially over their the lower level of their parking along the main street frontage, and it hasn't. When I took this picture, it's probably a little bit more developed now, but it probably is looking a little bit more like this now. And then the main reason we included a fee in lieu option was we realized that smaller infill projects wouldn't really produce enough required public open space to truly be usable, and it would kind of compromise some of the other things that we were trying to get projects to do to address the street. So along the north side of 185th, right across from Edition Apartments, are 3 small townhome projects, 5 units here on the skinny lot in the middle, 13 at this end, and 11 at this end. The only one that is actually proposing to provide on-site open space is this one, and they had an opportunity at the corner adjacent to a bus stop to provide a corner space that seemed to be viable, and it didn't fully fulfill their requirement. So I think all of them are going to be paying fee in lieu, at least to partially meet their requirements. The 5-unit one would only be required to do 750 square feet of public open space, which we didn't feel was really worth doing as a separate piece. It's far below the standard for the minimum size of a public open space in our code, which is really more directed towards the larger projects.
How much is the fee in lieu? Like, give us some numbers.
Basically the formula is it's the cost of the land. Basically it's intended to provide the money what it would cost to provide the open space itself. So the cost of the land plus the development cost for open space. So we're basing the land cost on the appraised, the King County, in downtown, the King County assessor's appraised value, and then we're basing the development cost on recent downtown open space development projects.
So so a hypothetical, if a 7,500 square foot lot was required to build a 750 square foot of open space, it would be 10% of the appraised value would be the fee in lieu, plus whatever the development cost is.
Yeah, yeah, roughly.
And I realize that's a bad example because I don't think that's the actual size, but,
It's actually pretty close, but
okay.
the requirement is based on the number of units, though, 50 square feet.
Just curious if that is the as-built appraised value or pre-development appraised value?
The land value,
Just under the,
yeah.
okay.
So in the case of the addition there, that public open space would presumably be maintained by the management of that property.
Yes.
Now, for the fee in lieu, where it's somewhere else, like Horse Creek Plaza, for instance, does the city end up responsible for the maintenance of that?
It will, yeah.
So there is a bit of a cost shift, it seems.
That's right.
Okay.
One other example, I didn't provide pictures of it, but the Popkini Way, the diagonal road that leads up towards Popkini Stadium from the curve where 98th curves into 185th, that has pretty ample public open spaces on both sides, and there the developer built that open space and is going to maintain it. So that's the one situation where the developer is actually maintaining, well, actually all of the other examples, but they're actually maintaining public open space that's in the public right-of-way. That was part of the development agreement for that. Oh, and one other example, this is a project that's just starting construction called The Pop, right adjacent to Popkini. Or no, actually it's down here. So it's this trapezoidal shaped lot, and this is a diagram that the developer did to show how, in their view, how unreasonable the open space requirement was. Their development agreement requires them to do 12,500 square feet of office space, so that's the size of that. Based on the number of cars that they could efficiently park in their garage, they are doing, I can't remember how many units off the top of my head, but it resulted in a 11,500 square feet of required public open space, which is a pretty good size chunk of the property. And they further made the argument that they're right next to the Horse Creek Plaza site and this open space along Popkini Way that they were building and had agreed and required to maintain. So they didn't feel like it was a reasonable amount. And they're not the only developer that has pushed back on this requirement. So we thought it was worth taking another look at, what they wound up proposing is a triangular open space here adjacent to the Horse Creek Plaza. They proposed what is known as a Wooner. I don't know if any of you have heard that.
I looked it up. It's pretty cool looking.
A Dutch word for essentially a street that's shared by cars and pedestrians. And we were pretty skeptical about that because it's really just the drive aisle accessing the garage. But we said, the only thing that would really make that viable walking passage would be if you were able to connect it through to the park. So then people could, when they're taking their dog out for a walk around the building, they could use that. And you're really going to have to convince us that you're able to design that in a way that's going to be attractive and safe public open space. And that's an ongoing effort. I just met with them this morning with some new plans that we're promising. So that's part of it.
Oh, Dave, sorry. Kevin made a great point here a little bit ago that I'm probably never gonna forget. So this winter, so like an example like that looks very city maintains it
Nope.
thing. No?
No.
Okay.
This is all their property. They're going to have a second phase of their development over on this side. And this north piece is actually shared between this developer and the North Shore School District. And the school district needs access to the backside of their scoreboard. And so we're working out an agreement for the developer to build this passage. It'll be landscaped and open to the public, and it'll provide for the access that the school district needs. So we're hoping that it really will work quite nicely. And then the last piece of their public, that still didn't quite meet their requirement. So they proposed to open up their upper level terrace, their second level terrace, which also provides access to these 3 townhome type units along that terrace. So it has publicly accessible stairs leading up here. It has ADA accessible entry through the lobby and up the elevator and into this terrace space. And again, we've said you really need to show us how that's going to be perceived and used as public through signage, wayfinding, programming, and so that's still a bit of a work in progress as well. All in all, they're providing more. They're providing about 16,000 square feet in these different places. So we kind of discounted the square footage a little bit because it's not all at grade, but the requirement in the downtown plan does just say that it needs to be accessible from a public sidewalk. We're going to give this a try and see how it works.
The memory's a little fuzzy, and Pat may remember it, but when we were on the park, and Roger as well, but we were on the Parks Board, I remember we were going through they were talking about the plans for the downtown, defining these open spaces, and my recollection is that angled road to Popkini was supposed to be, I know we have the park there, but they were supposed to be, that was going to be a space of a lot of open space, like we could have a farmer's market there, and we could have, and so that latest proposal, I mean, I know we're not in the planning department, but that feels like an amenity to the townhomes rather than something that's accessible to the public. If you got to go through their lobby, and I mean, you will have a staircase, but
This proposal here.
yeah, this proposal, exactly, yeah, the bottom right one seems, if we're trying to, that the idea of that angled street was it was kind of a gathering place in that part of downtown, given its shape and less trafficked. It's like one of the only less trafficked areas in the whole downtown project, that could be a more pedestrian open space. So that was my recollection of the time on the Parks Board.
Yeah. So, and that space has been built, and I think it is open to the public. I've yet to see anyone using the bocce court that they built there, but and then the east side is the bigger space that has the bocce court. The west side has Horse Creek, fills up most of that, although there's still generous sidewalks. So that promenade up to Popkini has been built, I think, pretty much as the Park Board had envisioned. We're still working on the final connection up to the stadium through Horse Creek Plaza.
Dave, when you're at Popkini now and you look to the south, there's cranes and there's a big construction going on. Where is this site here that's under design relative to the construction that's going on right now?
It is that site.
Okay, so it's under, the building's under construction?
Yes.
And you're still under some kind of review? I'm not sure what the process is on that, but so can you give us like an update of where the approvals are versus the construction? And usually you get approvals, then you construct.
Right. we conditionally approved their plans for these open spaces, and as these will be the last things that are built, so we're continuing to review those and push them to meet the, what we.
Okay. So the building's permitted and you're working on the.
Yeah.
I'm afraid I'm not following the ball on this. What exactly is the ask in this section?
Oh, so what we, and we haven't done, we don't have any proposed amendments, but we wanted to hear from the Planning Commission and from the public when we get to public hearing, how they feel this public open space requirement is working. And we anticipate asking the Planning Commission if you want to make some adjustments to it, either the amount that they were requiring or the criteria for the open space.
So looking back at the first slide, and don't bother rolling back, but you know, the 104 space never struck me as public use. I know I've walked by it a few times and never would have thought to take a quick seat in there and enjoy the day. But I did live in London for 2 years, and there's tons of little nooks like that. So I can appreciate now hearing that it is public space, because 50 years from now, somebody will walk by that space during their lunch and enjoy lunch. I think public space is super important. I'm a little hesitant about having tight little corridors like the 104 space, and more thinking of having larger open spaces, and not Grand Central Park large, but you know, as downtown Bothell evolves and more people are working downtown, they're going to want to get out on days like this and enjoy the city. And if we're going to make them climb stairs to go to a second floor that's next to somebody's townhome, sure, maybe that's enjoyable, but I don't ever think I would think to go up those stairs. Maybe if there's big signage, I would, but even then, I'm next to somebody's townhome. I'm a little hesitant to think this is the way forward. I would rather see more 104 style, street level, open areas, and then frankly, just open area. You know, I hear their concern, 11,000 square feet is a lot, but it's a service to their residents and their commercial space, and it's a service to the rest of Bothell to have that space. And if we're going to just concrete the entire city, then, well, let's concrete the whole city. But I'd like to see and maintain open space that's usable, not upstairs, not next to somebody's apartment.
Yeah, and I'm going to concur with Aaron. I think public space is really important, but it needs to be welcoming. It needs to be apparent that it is a public space rather than an amenity to the developer that he uses to sell his property. That second floor, I have a hard time seeing use. I agree there. It just doesn't seem like a welcoming, open public space. And, you know, I get the 104. It does, and I started with architecturally, I think it's a really good thing. I think it breaks up the mass and perhaps over time, but it's not one that strikes you right away. I could get to that one, but second floor, I've got some trouble with.
I guess looking at, you know, you're really kind of looking at, seems to make sense at a certain size of your project to provide this type of open space. And I think with the smaller projects, you know, I don't know. I think you would probably want to incentivize or push the applicant more towards a fee in lieu of. That would be my take. And then if you're going to require an on-site public space, yeah, I think it just needs to be somehow demarcated, or I think people need to know. I mean, I probably drive past the 104 2 or 3 times a day, and it is a nice little space, but it's got residential units around it, kind of eyes on it, you know. So it's a little bit weird, but you know, I can certainly see using it, but I wasn't aware that it was. You know, I would feel weird walking into it and, you know, just sitting down and, you know, and hanging out and eating lunch or whatever. So I guess my recommendation would be that if we're going to require it, maybe there's a size where if the development is less than a certain size, we just say, hey, look, we'd rather you do a fee in lieu of, in which case, the planning department needs to kind of start looking at potential locations for where they can start, and there probably is right now, but where they can start either adding or enhancing some of the pockets we do have in downtown for open space. And then secondarily, just somehow starting some kind of initiative for these that talks about, hey, we have all these little pockets of public open space around town, and, here they are, and somehow just information for the general public on that.
I think it's probably worth noting that the Planning Commission has, I'm guessing, no jurisdiction to dictate how this property develops, and our opinions here are merely examples of if we want to make future code amendments for future properties. So that's the context here. So just so that everyone understands, we're not backseat driving the design process for this particular project, because we couldn't do that. But I do share the comments of street level accessible open spaces. And I'll also point out another Parks Board comment, just so it's in the room, that we did talk about all of these little pocket parks, and there was concern on the Parks Board at the time with their limited staff, which I assume is still limited relative to the assets they have to manage, that they didn't want all of these small little pocket, they didn't want them to be city property that they would have to then cut the grass, because that would stretch them even thinner than they were, because they were all such small, not close to each other sites that would be a nightmare to maintain for the city. So.
Yeah, and that's one reason why these are all privately maintained. So there are opportunities, though, in this round for code amendments that we could say that the fee in lieu is only available for projects a certain size or less, or we could, and maybe allowing some flexibility, the director some flexibility in deviations. And we can certainly look at the whether the amount that we're requiring is reasonable, and then some of the other conditions. Right now, the minimum dimension of a public open space is 20 feet, unless it's a project of a size that requires at least 3,000 square feet. Then they can divide it into multiple pieces, in which case the smallest one has to be at least 1,000 square feet with a minimum dimension of 15 feet, which is also the dimension of a passage like this, similar to this connection across the north side of the POP. So those are all subject to review and potential amendment. I think that was the last open space. Yep. So the fourth code amendment, if you're ready to move on, has to do with potential amendments to the design review process for downtown projects. And design review can be a bit of a loaded term. We go through a administrative development review projects on a process on all projects that it's an integrated review that involves planning, building, transportation, engineering, and fire. And in the downtown core, or what the downtown plan has identified as the downtown special review area, which goes from SR 522, oops, using the wrong buttons here, from 522 north to 185th, and from Bothell Way over to 104th. Any projects that meet the SEPA thresholds in that area are required to go to the Landmark Preservation Board for an advisory review in a public meeting. So not only does the board have a chance to comment on them, the public has an opportunity to comment. The current regulation is that has to happen before building permits are issued. And we've heard a concern that in some cases, even though we try to encourage developers to bring projects to the landmark board early in the design process, that sometimes it doesn't happen as early as they would like. The feeling is that the design is set by the time they have a chance to review it. And it's a little bit of a chicken and egg issue. You want to have a complete enough design. The landmark board wants to see materials and design details, but they also want to be able to, even though they have they don't have approval authority, they're strictly advisory. They want their advice to have a chance at least to be incorporated into the project. So we are considering a change to that, and the obvious one would be that we would require this meeting to happen before building permit applications are made. And so that's kind of at the limit what this code amendment would look at the minimum. There are some other things that we could consider while we're at it. The downtown plan has historic resources regulations, mostly guidelines, but a few requirements, and we could take a look at those and see if there's any tweaks needed there. We have an opportunity to coordinate with the Landmark Preservation Board and our Historic Preservation Consultant, who have received a grant to study historic districts focused on the downtown area, and not necessarily just this DSRA, but could be even more tightly defined. And this also creates an opportunity perhaps to look at our pedestrian-oriented retail requirement on Main Street. We've heard from the Chamber Committee of Downtown Merchants that perhaps we need to tighten up that requirement, that there are some uses that are going in on Main Street that aren't as pedestrian-oriented retail as they would like to see. So that's what we've got. I think that's all I have on this issue.
Hey, Dave,
Yeah.
could you back up just real quick? So that area that's highlighted there, I guess in white, would you say the intent of this this overlay is more along the lines of preserving existing structures that are being improved or redeveloped, or is it to guide new development where you might even have a vacant piece of land and you're building a building to be consistent with what's already there? I'm not sure if I'm asking that right, but there's preserving historic structures and landmarks, and then there's trying to make sure that new structures are kind of consistent or I guess respecting what's already there in terms of the feel of the area. Is it both of those, or is it more one or the other?
I think it's both. In where we do have existing structures, the guidelines encourage not only preservation but restoration to the original facades. But this area is within that downtown core that has a 65-foot height limit. So while the ability to redevelop is going to be tempered by the ability to provide parking to go up that high, we're starting to see some proposals for more intensive development. So it's both to preserve what is there that's worth preserving, and to make sure that the new stuff isn't necessarily isn't mimicking what's there, but it has some of the same qualities and the same fine-grained detail, and that's all included within the not just the historic regulations, but the general architectural regulations require storefronts to have a kind of a fine grain design. And
Would you say
quality
also
materials.
part of the intent of that is to kind of keep I mean, especially on the main, couple blocks of Main Street there, you've got a really small scale because the lots are small. So you have a really small town feel, particularly along that core. And I know that, a little bit north of there, the Addition, I guess, was the one we were looking at building there. I remember back when they were doing their proposal, and we were looking at code amendments in downtown for building separation and setbacks. And I believe that project in particular was kind of forced to just, instead of try to develop on each of those little lots, basically just combine all those and do one big building, because the building separations and setbacks was just going to basically force them, it wasn't going to be a viable project for them. So they, I think, combined all those. So it turns out it's a much larger scale development, scale-wise, when you compare Main Street to that thing, as well as the Merck. I mean, those are really big. You've got small town Main Street, but then kind of around it, you've got some bigger scale stuff. And so I don't know if any thought's been given to that. Is that a thing where if somebody bought the block, north of the Main Street Mall, and they're going to do a big, huge development there, they would have to kind of try to break that up a little bit and make it a little bit modular with the building design, so there's not just a big, huge, massive building next to charming Main Street.
So the downtown regs there's what we call storefront design requirements that require fine grain articulation of those storefronts. So those would be applied to that kind of development. And I'll bring those regulations next time so we can take a look at that. But one thing we do encourage, the downtown, the historic buildings in downtown it's a pretty eclectic mix. We have everything from turn-of-the-century traditional commercial architecture to some 50s, there's actually some really nice 50s, more mid-century modern architecture. And we'd like to keep that mix and then have the new buildings that are built be of their time as well, but have the same quality as the historic buildings. One thing I forgot to mention, the purple shading in this are all the buildings that are, at the time of the downtown plan, were eligible for the historic inventory, which just means they're 50 years older or more. And there's probably a few that have aged into that category since then.
And several of those are now gone, too.
Yes, including the old City Hall.
Right, yes. And I was just going to add, I think you've hit on what is probably one of the more challenging things that we have to try to address in downtown, and that's balancing the historic character with the existing buildings, with the newer buildings that are going to be built there, not just in terms of the architecture, but also in terms of the scale. And that's something that council has raised as well, and we're going to be looking at different ways that we can look at the regulations we have. As Dave pointed out, we have several things already that try to address that. There are different opinions about the new buildings that have come up in downtown and whether those are the appropriate scale or whether, design could be different on those. So we're constantly looking at that and seeing how we can improve on it.
Mike, you came from Bellevue, right? And so with Bellevue Main Street, I know it's always been upgraded over the years from what it is, but it still feels like a small, just that couple block Main Street there. And does it have, is it as large going back from the Main Street that we have as far as historic area? Because it still feels like it has that character, yet it's, you're saying no, you don't think so?
Well, it doesn't seem like it when I go to but go ahead.
What? Just the Main Street, but
You're talking about Old Bellevue.
Old Bellevue, yeah. Yeah, it's just south of
From
Bellevue
Bellevue
Square.
Way, west toward the lake.
Yes.
I don't recall what protections they have in place. They don't have the same historic preservation mechanisms that we do here in Bothell.
Okay.
They do look at they limit the height, they limit the amount of building. But there are some newer buildings that have gone up along Bellevue Way, for example, right at the corner there, that are much bigger scale and contemporary architecture that have created a different gateway into the old Old Town area of Bellevue. There are also some taller, modern buildings that have gone up between Main Street and the downtown park. So it's a very limited area, and I think it has more to do with just the fact of the zoning, the property ownership, and the small parcels that are along there. We have some of that in downtown Bothell, but that doesn't necessarily preserve those buildings. As Commissioner Cecil pointed out, a lot of times there's a consolidation of properties as well. So to answer your question, it's not quite the same in
Okay, I was
in
just
Old Town
curious, too.
Bellevue. Yeah, they approach it a little differently, and I think has more to do with the rents in the market there.
So looking at the downtown core, the density is an important part of it, getting the pedestrians in, getting people able to walk to those businesses. But if it is going to be the heart of Bothell, as one of the earlier slides said, you also need to be able to get people from a little further away, and they're going to drive in to get there. So I urge you to keep in mind accessibility and parking. And there's already a lot of rumbling about parking. I can get into the spots on Main Street, but it's a challenge. Getting people from further away able to come in and patronize those businesses and come to some of the activities on Main Street, there's got to be a place for them to park, basically. So I'd like to keep that in mind.
And that's an important point. I have heard a lot about parking in my very short time here. And I will tell you, in other places that I've worked, in downtown Renton, for example, parking was a big issue. And we did a lot of work on parking studies. And what we found, and I don't know if that's true in downtown Bothell, but I suspect there may be some similarities there, is that parking was about 60% utilized in downtown Renton, even though everybody said there wasn't enough parking. Typically, they wasn't parking immediately in front of the store that they wanted to go to. I overlaid South Center did an overlay, map overlay of South Center on downtown Renton, and found that you actually had to walk a lot farther from parking at South Center to get to the mall than you did from the parking lots that were, ringing downtown Renton. So a lot of it is perception, I think. But you're right. I mean, we need to look at how much parking is really appropriate for that. We don't want to overpark downtown either. The other thing I will say is that was very true in downtown Renton is that the businesses that were the most successful, that had the most activity, had no parking associated with them whatsoever. But they were enough of a destination that people found, they came downtown and they found a place to park in order to go to those stores or those uses. So part of it is demand-driven to make sure that you've got the things that are drawing the people into the downtown as well. And then you're right, you do need to provide sufficient parking for those areas.
Yeah, and I'm not advocating that there be massive paved areas for a bunch of cars down there. Part of it is letting people know where the parking is.
Absolutely.
People do once through on Main Street, and boy, they're small, and they're all taken anyway, and where am I going to go?
Right.
And they don't think of it. I will say the spots south of Main Street are quite often full. So there's parking there, but that's full. So you got to go a little further, which again is doable. We should also look at the handicapped accessibility. And I think there are some challenges there as well.
Yeah. All good points, and that is something that I think we're always going to be taking a look at and seeing where we can make those improvements. As we get more development in the downtown, looking at how much more parking do we need to serve those. And like you said, we're trying to draw more people into the downtown as well. So it's a lot of different factors that go into that.
Yeah, as someone who comes downtown a lot, I regularly park in City Hall, and I always smile or chuckle that the people that talk about how expensive City Hall was don't realize what a big parking garage it is, and that's probably a good percentage of that expense was digging the hole and providing all that parking. And that's, I think if we get signage, because I think to your point about Renton and South Center, it's not, the downtown is so small, you could literally walk across the whole thing in 5 minutes, or at a good walking pace, or 7 minutes. So I think it may be signage and helping people, because I think there is still, even with the sea change in people coming downtown. I remember we had a friend 10 years ago, and we were walking downtown at 9 o'clock on a Friday night, and it was a ghost town. Nobody on the street, nobody around, and Nobody would even characterize that today with how much activity with the restaurants and how much Bothell has changed. But there is still a lot of parking. And I think over time, we're already seeing this, that more and more people are, they don't have cars, and they're going to have other modes of transportation, whether it's bus, whether it's, the Uber, Lyft, whether it's, all those options, I think are going to become even more prevalent for cities everywhere, that having a car that you only use 5% of the time is going to start, that trend I think is going to continue, even out here.
Yeah, that dynamic is changing things. It's not an immediate change. So there's a certain amount of parking that we're going to have to provide over time until we get to the point where we can actually look at reducing the amount of parking that we actually have. And I know in some places, in Belleville, for example, a couple of the developers I was working with there on some projects were looking at building parking structures as part of their development today, but they were already thinking down the road about how they could convert that later on to other uses. So that thinking is already happening out there.
Just a couple comments. I'm glad Commissioner Wickmeyer brought up Bellevue Main Street. I just drove through there last week, and it felt like the most relaxed, natural part of Bellevue. I mean, right down the street, you've got a bunch of new development going up, and it's kind of a good synergy between the new and the old. And as much as we can protect Main Street while knowing that modern development and other buildings are coming in, I think they've done a good job there. And whether it's been restricted or just a natural occurrence, they've mastered it. So, and to Commissioner Cecil's comment about the massing and some of our design standards, I'm kind of interested to look at how we break up some of the larger developments just architecturally to kind of fit in with some of the smaller existing structures. I think we've seen a little bit of departure from, it was obviously just a visioning process, but the early drafts had kind of modern architecture matching the police station. What we have now is a lot more modern looking in some of the developments. Not a bad thing, it's just we're sort of changing. So it'd be nice to go back and look at the design standards, make sure we're kind of staying in line with what we were expecting.
And that certainly can be part of the scope of this last item, looking at the standards, particularly the standards in the historic resources section of the downtown plan.
And this may not really, well, no, it does apply, but there, at the end of our last commission meeting, there was an architect in the audience who lives downtown, and he gave us, I'll give you a copy of it later, David, you missed one meeting, but he handed them out, and I don't know if they're actually an official attachment at the meeting. They were kind of just handed out afterwards. I guess they could be attachment number 3, but it was called The Missing Middle, and it's just, it was just really exciting. I was looking into it online and looking at what it is, and basically it just seems to really fit in with this. I know, there's a height limit downtown with required parking and all. I just think it could be super exciting for downtown. I think people talk about Main Street, and Main Street is wonderful. I frequent it often, walk down it all the time. I think Main Street could not only be expanded east and west, it wouldn't officially be a Main Street, but Northeast 183rd has some just really, really super cool. I would say that block on Northeast 183rd between 103rd and 102nd. I mean, that's like I would love to see, I would love for that to be a historic district, because the houses there are just perfect. I mean, they're well maintained. It's really cool. Anyway, I think you could do some really cool stuff with design standards around that area, this whole area that we're talking about. They could just expand what we're doing here with regards to Main Street and the Promenade or Bothell Way. I think it's really exciting. So I'm really glad this was on the agenda tonight. So thanks for bringing it. And I know we'll continue to talk about it on September 5th. But I think it's really cool. It's interesting to hear what all the commissioners are talking about with regards to it too. Yeah.
Well, and as much as I talked about parking, there are other solutions as well, and I believe it's Issaquah that has a connector, the 200 bus that rolls around, and I believe it might be free. And I don't know what the deal is with Metro with that. There's also one in Seattle, 99, that you can get people around that are a little further out. There are other mass transit ways of doing it.
Good point. And they're not free. They're just no fare.
Well, yeah, I spend a lot of time in government. Nothing's free, but to the user, they're more
Right.
user-friendly.
Yes, exactly.
There are other ways, rather than taking it out of the land,
Mm-hmm.
you're using another way to get people there. There are other solutions.
Good point, yes. And just to Commissioner Vliet's point, the other thing that we have to keep in mind as we're looking at the downtown in particular is that is one of our major growth centers. So when we talk about preserving certain areas and we're reducing the capacity of the downtown, that takes the capacity out of the plan in terms of what we have for growth. So that's not to say we can't do that, but you just need to keep that in mind as we talk about some of these areas. I mean, one of the reasons we're looking at some of the things that Dave talked about tonight as far as the upzones is to make sure that we're always looking at our capacity, particularly our capacity for affordable housing. So this is one of the areas where we have those opportunities as well. So I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, noted.
I wanted to make one, I know parking always does come up, and one of the 6 downtown code amendments that was initiated was, or really continued, was to continue to look at the parking requirements in downtown. But that's going to be done as part of a broader parking management planning effort, and so that will be moving forward, and eventually we'll come back to Planning Commission. But we've separated that out from these 4 that we're moving forward on now. I also wanted both Commissioner Morrow-Cook and I guess Commissioner Wickwire's comments and Cabe's comments about open spaces in London or Old Town Bellevue. We've got 6 weeks between now and when we come back. So I've got a homework assignment for you. As you're out traveling about on your vacation, even if it's just to Bellevue or Edmonds or wherever. Or where?
Or London.
Or London. Keep your eye out for examples of things like small open spaces that actually work, and try to look with a critical eye and see if you can figure out if they're public or private, if they're part of a private development, privately maintained or public, and take pictures, bring back what you find. Feel free to share it with me, and we can include that into the discussion. Same thing on the standards for downtown. If you see some historic districts that you really think are working well, that we can learn from, bring those back too.
And I would just add to Dave's assignment, in addition to those pictures and what you see that you like, explain why you like it. What is it that makes it work for you?
So I was in Edmonds 2 weekends ago and looking at small open spaces. They have a much smaller scale downtown, but something that is just remarkable about Edmonds is every corner has the most amazing little gardens that are all maintained by different people. So I don't know if it's an they all have a similar bamboo fencing that kind of shows that they're all the same. And I don't know if they have public water that gets to them, but and it's tough for us because we're much more of an urban downtown. But if that's a way that we can encourage both individual expression of the people that are downtown, and just extreme beauty on every corner. I mean, literally every corner, every 4, points of a corner for the entire downtown as you go. Kind of, I forget they have the roundabout there, but everything kind of going down to the ferry, is all privately maintained yet publicly beautiful. They're taking these little corners and so
Within the public right of way.
within the public right of way, but making them available, and every one of them is different. I mean, there's common elements, but they're and they say who are the people who are maintaining them. There's a little placard there. So it's, if there's something that we could do with that in the spaces in downtown, it's a way of humanizing and getting to a more pedestrian scale, even if we have these hardscapes and all these other things that we will have because of our, bigger built environment that we have here versus, cute little Edmonds, so.
And then I also had a chance in June, I guess, late June, to spend a couple weeks in Italy and a little bit of time in France and Geneva. And the one thing that struck me really heavily was their open space is pretty much everywhere. I mean, you're walking down an alley that looks like it's like a trash route, and you just look to the left and there's a restaurant, a super nice restaurant with just it's a hole in the wall. And then you've got other streets where there's just people gathered everywhere. And so when I was helping out with the downtown redevelopment, one of the folks, I think with the Friedman group, gave us an assignment to read this book called, I think it was called The Death of the American City, something like that, Life and Death of American City. One of the concepts that they talked about, which was really interesting, was we've lost, for some reason, we've lost the concept of our streets being open spaces. We treat them as like dirty, just kind of conduits to get cars through. And so just the whole concept of, and we're doing this in Bothell, we're building density downtown. There's more and more eyes on the street, and so it's no longer like a blight necessarily. But along the lines of what you're talking about, how do we enhance our streets and it might be next to a park that just makes a park bigger and it spills out into the street, and you've got, especially in the boulevard, right? We got huge areas there, and a lot of things are being done, I think, with the outdoor seating for restaurants and that kind of thing. But I guess maybe just putting that down as one of the items to look at as you're talking about open space in this area is we got these streets, and a lot of them are small scale streets, so what can we do to those to maximize the open space and gathering potential on the streets?
In most cities that have a grid system, a small grid system like we have here in Bothell, streets represent the right-of-way, public right-of-way represents about 40% of the land. So that is an important thing to keep in mind. And more cities are starting to think of their streets as public open space as opposed to just a way to convey vehicles, because that is something that I think you're right, we have lost. The older European cities were not built for automobiles, they were built for smaller vehicles and people. And that's one of the big differences that, between that development pattern and ours.
Well, and one way to move in that direction is to have walks. And I spent a little time in Australia last fall, and you go on and you look, walks in Melbourne, and there are just paths, and there'll be a house back there, and you look, and there'll be a little thing, and that's what's happening at that house. And we had the town gown loop here that I'm not sure recovered from Main Street. But you could identify, and that would link some of these smaller public spaces, that if, someone went in and looked for Bothell walks, and there's a loop this way, and, you can have a seat over there, and you can, this house means that there. You'd begin to bring those spaces together and make it, just more unified.
Yeah, that's a good idea. You can make an app for it.
Yeah,
with
sure.
A little information about the buildings or the area that you.
Yeah, and that's what we were doing there. And, even saw this coolest mailbox, just really a wrought iron mailbox just in front of a private house. But you walk by and, wow, that was pretty impressive. I got a photo in here somewhere. But, that's the way you get people out. You get these public spaces in more use and really unify the city.
Commissioner Wickwire was talking about Edmonds, and it triggered something in my mind about downtown Bellevue. There are actually a lot of public spaces in downtown Bellevue that many people do not know about. Some of them are on second levels. So if you do go to Bellevue over the next few weeks, downtown Bellevue, particularly if you go to the Arts Festival this coming weekend, I think, look for those. They are signed. And they are not necessarily that visible from the sidewalk, but you'll see signs that say, public access or something like that. And you may go up some stairs and you'll find these plazas. in behind different buildings, a lot of the taller buildings in downtown Bellevue. Some of them get pretty good use. We did a survey several years ago. Staff went out and at lunchtime, and we just kind of did a canvas of how many people were in these spaces. Some of them were used just by smokers, basically. That was their smoking area. Others were, much more used by the broader public. So it is important to have these, even, whatever the level they're on, but to make sure there is good signage and people know about them, and to do things like you're talking about, which give people maps and tools to find them.
The comment about streets as open space reminded me that in the original proposal for the downtown plan, we proposed that developers were building new public frontages, sidewalks, be able to count that towards their public open space requirement. And the Planning Commission at the time pushed back hard on that. They said no, they didn't buy this idea of streets as open space. So that may be something we can revisit as we're looking at that requirement. Maybe that would make the current requirement more reasonable for new developers.
I think that they make it a much more inviting pedestrian area.
So we've given you your homework assignment between now and September 5th. So I think we've had plenty of questions, but what we're looking for from you tonight is any additional analysis that you'd like to see us bring back for the continued study session on September 5th. We've already talked about that we're going to be doing the housing capacity and affordable housing requirement analysis. I'm going to be working with our historic preservation consultant on some analysis of the historic features downtown. But anything else that's come up that you'd like to see us bring back?
I wouldn't have to be specific, but just a rough density analysis based on some of the upzones. So for those areas, what we think the max population increase or change of use would create.
Yeah, and that would be part of the analysis that we do to get to that affordable housing requirement.
Dave, I'm looking at item A under the background of your memo. Talks about the parking management plan. Is that something that's underway currently, or is that something that's completed or hasn't started yet? Or
It's something that was started, and it's kind of on hold right now, but we're about to start the second phase of that work.
is that something that's going to progress along enough to where it could potentially inform us what we're looking at here, or should we not really count on that?
And with regard to any particular?
Well, the parking requirements and that kind of thing that we've been talking about.
I'm not sure if it's going to really dovetail. The one part that I think we will want to at least consider, and maybe potentially even make a recommendation, right, the SR 522 corridor currently uses the citywide parking requirement, essentially 2.2 spaces per unit. And one thing that's in the parking study that we've been talking about is to re-examine that and potentially utilize the requirement that we've adopted for the general downtown corridor there. So I think, yes, we will definitely be taking a look at that in terms of the GC to SR 522 corridor zoning. Not that that'll be part of this recommendation, but we're going to analyze that, and perhaps there can be a recommendation that would be incorporated into the parking amendments when they do come.
There were quite a few comments earlier. I don't know if you covered it, Dave, and I don't know how we do this, or if we even need to do it, but let's just go back to the 104 example of people not knowing that, maybe the public could could be there. And maybe that's not a good example because there's, you're kind of surrounded by people's living quarters. So, but I don't know, are there other cities that are like Bellevue, or are there other ways to to sign these areas as basically a public space? So people, it's kind of weird, like if you're walking through, if you're walking in parts of Italy or whatever, you're not necessarily going to have signs that say, oh, you sit here, it's a, nice table. Public. But around here, it may not be, it may be kind of new to say, oh, that I can go there. That looks like it's for the people, the residences. So I don't know if there's any towns that are doing it or if we'd even want or need to do that, but.
Well, I think we can look at ways to make it more obvious that it's a public space and encourage people
Yeah,
to use that.
that's it. Yeah, more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One specific question I had in terms of additional analysis, Dave put up some analysis on the height for the SR 522 rezone. I think that showed pretty clearly what the height impacts would be for that area. Did you want any additional analysis on that?
On the zone along 522?
Yeah. Specific to the height and the view blockage issue. Since that was what had come up, I think that was one of the main things that had come up before.
No, I
I'm
did.
not seeing anyone has a burning desire for more information on that.
Well, I think what you provided was you probably picked a pretty strategic parcel
Yeah.
that would interplay with that particular requirement, but I think any more detail, you'd have to look at every parcel and do a separate,
Yeah.
In my mind, I'm okay with where we're at.
Okay.
The one thing we were planning to do, and actually are already working on, is the example I showed is kind of what is the kind of the easiest development option on that, which is really limiting the building footprint to the bottom of the slope. But we did want to look at whether it was whether there's a feasible building layout in those areas that goes further up the slope and might have a further impact in terms of height, just so that we're sure that we're really showing the kind of the maximum possible impact of this. Yeah.
Can I ask just a quick question related to that? So we're talking about impacting views, and I'm not quite sure what we're assuming the view is of. I mean, is it the river? Is it the trees? I mean, maybe it's just a general territorial view, but there's, on the other side of that slough, the hill just goes up and there's trees everywhere.
Yeah.
So I guess what's the thought on?
Well, the testimony that council heard was about the view to the river, and whether that's to the water or the trees lining the river. I think that it's open to interpretation. And there's nothing in the city policies that protects views. So it's just it's a more of a neighborhood impact issue, and what basically to address the issue that was raised by and caused council to retain the GC zoning. The only place that we do protect views is in the shoreline district, where there are specific protections for view corridors.
So there's nothing in the Bothell Municipal Code with regards to not just views, maybe the river, that's a really good point, but like shading of areas, like blocking the sunlight, which is, I mean, right now it's been warm for a long time, but there's winter months that extend for a long time, and in spring, fall, that, the sun's lower. And so is there anything in the Bothell Municipal Code with regards to like shading? Or is it just purely like you can go 65 feet, there's no other kind of design review with regards to affecting neighbors?
I'd have to take a look. I know when we were doing the alternative energy code amendments a few years back, there was some talk about protecting solar access, but
Yeah, I would love to see something, I don't know, probably won't have time between now and next, when we meet, but, because it might be a separate topic for down the road, but, yeah, I think it's just, I think it could have a huge impact on residences, people who've lived there for a long time or new people. Just, I think it creates a really interesting opportunity for architects to create buildings that work with the sun. And so like, yeah, I don't know.
And there are
The-
shadow studies that can be
Shadows.
done, and
Oh,
sometimes,
that'd be good,
depending
yeah.
on the development and the impact, potential impacts, what's adjacent, what the zoning is, future use of those areas, that can look at those shadow studies through the SEPA process. So that is something that, I don't know that we have anything specific in our code to it, like you said, other than maybe for solar access. But typically, that's where that would be looked at, more on a case-by-case basis.
Thanks.
And since we are revisiting and talking about things for analysis, I still remain a little concerned about the U-turn on 522. And I'm looking at, very specifically a business like Yakima Fruit or the Preservation Kitchen to get across those 2 lanes of traffic in time to make that U-turn at 96th. The closer you get to 96, the tougher it is going to be to get across there. And then there's a long way to the next opportunity. It's something to be aware of and take a look at. And I think it is having a bit of an impact in Kenmore. And in Kenmore, you can take a right and come around behind those businesses. It's tough to get around behind the hill there. Think about coming out of Yakima, getting all the way across that traffic and making that U-turn. It's going to be challenging. So it's something to remain aware of, particularly with the speed of the traffic when it's moving.
So then the last question we had, as far as, is whether the commission feels like proceeding with all 4 of these items together or focusing first on one or more of them. I will say from staff, our recommendation is the rezone is one that we can only do the comp plan amendment once a year, so we would like to finish that one this year. And we do feel like that one has some relationship in that they both have the affordable housing aspect with the downtown, the DT density limits. So we would like to move those forward together. The other 2 could be dealt with separately, but if the commission felt like they wanted to move them forward together, we can certainly bring all 4 back for further analysis on September 5th, and then have a better sense about where we're at and whether we're close on some and not so close on others.
Does the transition district change also require a comp plan amendment, or is that just a code amendment?
That's just a code amendment, yeah.
So I guess just to keep in mind, if we do bring them back together, it could be a pretty long meeting because we're covering quite a bit. So as long as commissioners are okay with that. So,
Any thoughts?
yeah, does anybody have any thoughts? I'm going to speak with regards to that.
I'd be up for breaking them up. I mean, keeping, 1 or 2 together, whatever they make sense. So if we're talking about up zones or if we're talking about affordable housing on multiple topics, just for continuity. But I think trying to get through all 5, it's going to be some long.
You could also
meeting.
decide at the September 5th meeting if you wanted to go forward with a hearing on all of them at that point, too. So if you wanted to keep discussing them, we could keep working on all of them at this point, and then you could make a decision there.
Anybody else want to speak to that? I also I agree with Chair Pro Tem Cave here that that it does seem to be a lot to carry forward all at once.
Well, I certainly hear the need to move the annual items forward, so the land use issues. We should certainly prioritize those, and I think remain open as time allows. And if we get in too deep, be prepared to push some of the less pressing ones forward into future meetings. So I'd vote for scheduling them and then
Right.
cutting off as need be,
I see.
sequencing them rather.
So putting them all on the docket or on the agenda, but not necessarily maybe covering them all in that meeting. Just work on one, get through
Yeah.
it, break it up,
Set our priorities.
Prioritize them.
prioritize them. Okay, sounds good. And then I guess I don't know if you need our input on how to prioritize them. It sounds like you guys have a better idea of which ones we kind of need to move through first.
That would be our recommendation, is the first two,
Okay,
the zoning and the land use changes would go forward.
I'm okay with that. Looks like people are okay with that, yeah. Commissioners are fine. Great.
Thank you. Excellent.
Great. Those are a lot of good comments. I have a lot more to think about until September 5th, which will be the next time we're meeting. Let's see, no old business, staff reports?
Not really a staff report, but I remembered after the efforts to reschedule this meeting, I wanted to check in and make sure that people were checking their city emails regularly, and because I did kind of resort to going back to the personal emails just to check on availability for tonight. But are there any issues with using the city email that we should know about? Okay. I'm going to try to stick with that unless I need to get some feedback and I'm not hearing back. Yeah.
So just a point of clarification. So notifications for the next meeting usually come on Fridays?
We shoot for Thursday afternoon, but
Okay.
yeah.
I have a reminder to check my email 3 times a week. I probably do it 1.5 times a week, so I will try to do Thursday, Friday, just to make sure I catch it.
Okay.
I think I'll be fine. It's been so long since I've checked it, and now it's, it's in the brain
Gotten out of the
somewhere, so,
habit.
Yeah, I think we're fine.
Great.
Okay, thanks.
And then when does Gary's party Gary Hassler's going away thing? It's like the 30th or something?
It's next Monday
Okay.
at 2 o'clock
Next Monday at 2.
in here.
Okay,
Yeah,
here.
and you should have received,
Yeah.
an email on it.
Yes, yeah, we did, that's right.
On our city email?
Yes.
That's- Any reports from members?
I've got a report on a report that I will be making, just update there. The Capital Facilities Plan Process Committee meetings are happening August 6th and August 8th, and a while ago I volunteered to represent the group on it. So I'll be at those meetings, and in September I'll give you a report.
Fantastic. Okay, a motion to adjourn then.
So move to adjourn.
All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
We are adjourned.
Thank you.
Thanks.